remember, my first time getting into the operating room, and we're standing in this hallway, and at the very end of the hallway, there's a nurse that's coming towards us, and she keeps saying, "You can't be here with that thing on your head." She's talking about my hijab.
And she explaining further why you cannot go in?
No, she's like, "You can't wear this. You have to take it off." Okay. And I said, "Well, I'm not taking it off. Number one. Number two, like, I'm paying money to be here. So where's the policy that says I can't wear this?" And so that was my introduction to surgery, is that it is a very hostile place. They wouldn't even let me scrub in to watch them poke a needle into this big vessel. Like, I burned out. Like, my first year in practice, you have to work twice as hard to get half as far.
Dr. Hussein wins the top 10 Somali Excellence Award.
Yes.
Right? Every step of my journey, I had to be the one to fight back, right? To make the policy changes that I needed, to stand up for myself, to challenge, whatever, rules people wanted me to follow.
Dr. Qaali Hussein waxa ay laba shahaado ka qaadatay qaliinka dhaawacyada degdega ah iyadoo ah dhakhtar ka tirsan kulliyadda dhakhaatiirta caafimaadka Mareykanka.
I am a full-time double board certified trauma surgeon. I am also a mom of 6, but I found out when I was pregnant with my first child, that our program didn't have a maternity leave policy. Nobody ever got pregnant in the program and actually stayed. And that's the thing that I teach in Defiance Academy.
What does Defiance look like at home with 6 kids, with Muslim wife, a Somali of that? What does that look like?
Defiance looks like me not having to be the only person in the house that cooks. Me not being the only person in the house that cleans.
Sidoo kale Dr. Qaali waa aasaasaha iyo maamulaha Akademiyadda Defiance oo ah goobta horumarinta xirfadda iyo hogaaminta haweenka madowga ah.
Is this only women or is it open to everybody?
So I have had men go through my programs.
Okay.
Group coaching, we have a Defiant women community. I reserve that for women only because it's a safe space. We need to have women-only conversations.
How many of you are out there? How do you do this?
That's a very good question, and
Great. Dr. Qaali, welcome to Doctors and Poets. We established this podcast to highlight the professional Somalis who are doing really great things in their own rights. But mostly what I have seen, at least, is the people that you see in the media, the people who are out there, are usually not the ones who have, done great things in their lives. So I figured maybe because they're busy, maybe because they're camera shy. I know you're not camera shy because I've seen you out there. But for whatever reason, I feel like our cream of the crop, our very accomplished Somalis are not out there. So many others cannot learn from them, right? So this is why I started this. I'm very glad that we have you on. I will not try to butcher your introduction and explain what you do. So I will leave that one for you. So please welcome to Doctors and Poets and tell us a little bit about Dr. Qaali and who you are.
Thank you, Mohammed, for having me on this podcast. It's a pleasure to be here. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Qaali Hussein. I am a full-time double board certified trauma surgeon. I am also a mom of 6 and the founder of Defiance Academy, which is a career coaching and a leadership training platform for high-achieving women who are suffering from burnout from balancing family and career and all the things that are on their plate.
Great. We'll get to a lot of those, and I have some questions about that. But before we get to this, let's go back to early days. And you said you grew up in the U.S., but take us back to Somalia and what you remember and your journey to the U.S. and what was it like? What was it like?
So yes, I was born and raised in Somalia, and I was there until the Civil War, which started in, I guess, 1991. I came to the States in 92. But before that, my memory of Somalia is wonderful. I grew up with my ayeyo, my grandmother. We lived by the beach. I went to Duksi first. I learned Quran first. Nice. And I didn't start going to regular school until we moved to Kenya. So my first schooling didn't happen until I was in Kenya. My focus was on the Quran, and it was lovely. Like my experience in Somalia, and the first memories that I have is I grew up watching a lot of strong women who worked, who had kids. who, came home after work and came to my grandmother's house, and, it was a big family, and we had the community, and a, very supportive community and family. And so that's what I remember from Somalia. It was lovely.
Wow. Where in Somalia were you? You say you grew up around the
Mogadishu.
beach. Mogadishu, mashallah. I spent some time in Mogadishu as well. From Wardigle. Yeah. Hamarwena, I'm guessing, if you were around the beach.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a Hamadajab kid.
That's right on the beach. That's beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you end up moving to Somalia, to Kenya as a refugee, like many other Somalis did. Is that the Nairobi, Kenya, or the refugee
Nairobi,
camps?
Kenya. Nairobi,
Nice.
Kenya. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. So those days, right before moving to, at that age, I think you don't know a lot of what is going on politically and what people are saying. But if you describe a little bit, what was it like, your journey from Somalia to Kenya? And if you knew, or if the family knew this was going to be a last time you're going to see your home country, or if there's going to be like a little skirmish that you guys come back sooner, what was going through your head and what do you remember from it?
It was very traumatic,
Yeah.
because the war impacted our family directly. We had casualties. We had uncles who were victims who were killed because of the war, because of their tribe. As a 7-year-old, I accompanied my aunt looking for my uncle who was missing, and we identified and found his body by the beach. He was killed by gunmen, and they were standing there, hoping, the family members who come and claim him, they would just start piling bodies. And so that was my first experience. And I, pointed to him, and my aunt just, covered my mouth, and we ran home. And that was the reason we left. We left because our family was in danger. And when we were leaving, we were in this small little truck where the entire family was piled in. And, at the time, everybody leaving is taking their belongings, right? Whatever gold you have or whatnot. And so we were passing through these bushes, and our truck was fired upon. And my grandmother got hit. She had a bullet go through both of her legs, got on one side of her leg, went through the other side of the other leg. And so we had to stop by a village. We had that community help us. My mom basically took off her kapasat and tied her legs to keep her from bleeding. The community that we stopped by helped us and gave her some camel milk and to help resuscitate her. We drove back to the area where we just got shot at. And alhamdulillah, we were near Afgoye, and Afgoye is where Hawa Abdi, do you know Hawa Abdi?
How about the hospital and all that? Yes.
Yeah. So Hawa Abdi is my mom's cousin. So she's my
Wow.
Aya's niece. Yeah.
Wow.
So
And
we went to
at the
Afgoye.
hospital and clinic at that time also.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So
Wow.
she operated on her. Hawa Abdi saved my Aya's life. Hawa Abdi, she's my aunt. So she saved her life. She operated on her, stopped the bleeding, and that's where she recovered. We were there for a good, I think, 2 months. It might have been longer. I was a kid, but all I remember is this trauma. And then when she recovered, she still didn't walk. We finally found a flight out from Afgoye. We drove back same route. And we were in this small little plane, very small little plane, not much seats, maybe 2 or 3 seats, and there was space on the floor. And so it was me, my older sister, my mom, my ayeyo had to sit on the floor because she couldn't stand. And sitting next to her was a woman who was about 8 or 9 months pregnant. And this is a small little plane that is going up and down and up and down. So there's a lot of motion sickness. And the whole time I'm little, I'm sitting on my sister's lap. I'm throwing up in a bag. My sister's throwing up in a bag. Yeah. And my ayeyo, who is injured from this war, has, babis, and she's fanning this pregnant woman who looks like she's about to go into labor. And I remember my ayeyo looking at us, just with this disappointment of you guys are not strong enough, right? She's sitting there injured. This woman is 9 months pregnant, and she's fanning her, and she's looking at us like we're throwing up from seasickness. And that image of the strength that my grandmother had, like has always stayed with me. Like every time I had, challenges and was struggling, whether it was pregnancy or operating or whatnot, that strength that she had has always, that's the image that stays with me. But yeah, alhamdulillah, we made it to Kenya. And that's where she had more surgeries and she had to have skin grafts and did physical therapy and was finally able to walk, alhamdulillah.
So I don't know, maybe that was your first experience of a trauma surgeon room in a way of like someone wounded, someone on the floor. It sounds chaotic and kind of like the world you live in today.
It is very chaotic. At that time when all this was happening, the field of trauma surgery wasn't a thing in my head, right? Yeah. I didn't understand, that there was a world where there are surgeons that are trained to treat specifically these things. But that was my image. But wow. I've always liked medicine and wanted to do something with my hands. But when I first experienced, surgery and trauma,
right,
that image was always with me. And it was just, it clicked. I started doing trauma and it was, this is what I'm meant to do. I probably experienced that in order for me to be comfortable enough with this and to do this as my life's purpose.
Wow. Is your Ayeyo still with us?
No, she, Allah Rahma, she passed away when I was in medical school.
Allah Rahma, yeah. Well, she sounds very strong woman and had a lot of influence on you. That's beautiful.
Absolutely.
I'm also Ayeyo Kuris. I was raised by my grandma as well, so
How is Ayeyo Kuris? People make fun of us, but Ayeyo Kuris people, I think, have it made in life.
I actually agree. I tell people sometimes, have you heard about the mama Olodo Ayeyo Kuris? Maxaa lihi jiray horta alla ka qaadi Ayeyo Kuris ka dar.
Alla ka qaadi he?
Ayeyo Kuris ya alla ka qaadi ya dar.
Ya dar. Oh.
Like the one who you lost, right? Or
they're basically useless.
Right. I was raised my Ayeyo, and my Ayeyo was very she was strong, but also she was very, what do you call it? She was generous with compliments. So I grew up being told that I was great and smart and the best and all that stuff, and a lot of other Somalis didn't grow up around that. And I was like, well, you have some self-esteem issues because you didn't get enough compliments.
No, and that wisdom, I feel like Ayeyos have way more wisdom. Your parents are like, they're struggling. Like this is their first time parenting, right? But I feel like Ayeyos, they practice on their children. Now they have parenting down.
They perfected it at that age, yes. Unless things is spoiling, and maybe that's the right way to raise kids. I agree.
That is the right way to raise kids, yeah.
We'll get to raising kids because I know you have 6 of your own. Yeah, mashallah. And okay, so then could you explain a little bit then your transition to America and what you remember from those days of, coming, like the world that you described, moving to America and coming to a world that you had never seen before, language that is new, people that look different from you, what that was like for you?
Yeah, I think, coming to America, obviously it's, all of a sudden you're safe, right? Before you were running for your lives and your family members are being targeted and your Ayeyo is a victim of war and, she has all these injuries and you come to a place where it's safe. So I remember my Ayeyo used to always make dua for, I think it was Bush and then Clinton at the time. We came in around 92. And she used to always make dua for them. She's like, oh, we came here and we're blessed. God bless our American president. And so it was like this gratitude of having opportunity and having, access to, a safe place and education. So it was lovely. And, she was seeing doctors and getting the healthcare that she needed and did a lot more physical therapy. And I used to take her walking around the neighborhood every afternoon to get her physical therapy in. And then, I went to school, and going to school, it was, when I was in Kenya, I started school in Kenya, actually. And I was in, I think, first grade for like a month, and they're like, okay, we need to move you up. And then I was like second grade and third grade for like another couple of months. And then I came here.
Okay.
Like I was memorizing the Quran. So mentally I liked studying and I liked learning. And then when I came here, I started the 4th grade. And so I being a typical nerd, I was, all in and focused in school.
All right.
So it was lovely. And we had family here. So it wasn't like, we weren't fresh and didn't know anybody, and we had to figure our way out.
Yeah.
We had aunts and uncles who lived here, who were going to school here, who had established themselves here, and so we had that access.
That's awesome. When you say here, where are we talking about?
It's Houston.
Houston, Texas. Mm-hmm. Wow. I'm guessing there were not a lot of Somalis there at that time. I know there were not a lot of Somalis in America overall, but Houston specifically.
Houston, yeah, it was. We lived way out in, like, it was the country at the time. Now it's all built out. But yeah, we were one of the first Somalis that lived there. But then our family kept coming in and joining, so we were like our own little community. Yeah,
good,
it's pretty nice.
So, and then at what age or what grade did you know that you wanted to pursue medicine? And what did you do early days, either in middle school or high school, to get you ready for medical school ultimately?
So I knew I wanted to do medicine by the time I was in high school. I think it was 11th grade is when I decided. 11th grade was when a lot of things happened. I struggled with the hijab for a very long time. Right. That was one of the challenges of going to school here and growing up here. Is I've always been, modest, and I didn't like not wearing my hijab. But getting into fights at school, having your hijab pulled, it was challenging. And so my 11th grade year, I think it was the winter break of my 11th grade. I was just thinking about my future and looking, and envisioning myself as an adult, and what do I want to look like? How do I want to be? What do I want to do? And this image popped in my head, and it was, I was wearing a white coat and I was wearing this black hijab. And I actually took that picture in 2018.
Wow.
That is
picture out of your head.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That picture I took in 2018, and it's like the most commonly used picture online. If you look at my name, like, that's the picture that shows up. It's my white coat and my black hijab. That image popped into my head when I was in junior high, when I was in high school, junior, my winter break. And that was the decision that I made, is that's the person I want to be. I want to be a doctor. I want to maintain my hijab. I want to maintain my identity as a Muslim woman. And so I went from not wearing my hijab the semester before to wearing my hijab. And it was a decision that I made. And I remember that winter I was having a conversation with my IAO. And I was like, I want to be a doctor. I want to be a surgeon. I didn't know what kind of surgeon. I was thinking about heart surgery, cardiothoracic surgery, vascular surgery, something related to operating. Trauma, I still didn't know what it was. And I told her, I said, and I don't want to sacrifice having children. I want to have children. And I want to wear my hijab. And in having this conversation, I was telling her, I don't know if I can do it. Everybody keeps telling me it's going to be impossible. It's going to be challenging. I have to sacrifice one for the other. And she asked me this one question that to this day, every time I face a challenge, I ask myself. And she said, who are you waiting to give you permission? Said, who do you need to come to you and say, Qaali, you can do it. You have my permission to go and do it. You have my permission to wear your hijab. You have my permission to start having kids when you want. Who are you waiting for? And I was like, that's a very good question. I've never thought of it that way.
Such a profound question.
Right?
Yeah.
And this is a woman who has never gone to school. Like, she's the wisest person I have ever met in my whole entire life. She didn't go to school. She didn't know how to read or write. When she was in her 80s, she got tired of signing X as her name. Wow. And she learned how to write her name, Fatima. Her name is Fatima Ibrahim.
Yeah. Wow.
So she learned how to write in her 80s. She's like, I'm not a monkey. I'm not going to write an X. I can write. So I taught her, how to write her name in her 80s. But she's the wisest person I have ever met. And she was like, who are you waiting for? And so that question has stayed with me my entire career. Every time I want to do something, is like, who needs to give me permission? Nobody. Can I do it? Can I trust myself? Right? And so that's when I decided, okay, I'm going to wear my hijab. I'm going to pursue medicine. And then my senior year, I applied to a bunch of scholarships, and I was at a scholarship dinner, and I was sitting next to a Muslim woman who's a physician. Her son was also getting a scholarship. Okay. And I saw her. I'm like, one of my aunts is a doctor. She did internal medicine, and she trained in Thailand, practiced in Somalia. But when she came to the U.S., the whole process of going back to medical school and all of that was too much. So she's like, she didn't want to go through that. So medical background, medical knowledge, right? I could get from her, but navigating the system in the U.S., I didn't have anybody who did that. And so meeting a Muslim woman who's a doctor for the first time, she's not a hijabi, but she's Muslim. And so I start asking her questions, and she looks at me and she goes, if you're going to wear the hijab, yeah, you either give it up or don't even go into medicine. It's too hard.
A Muslim woman who's a doctor told you to either take off your hijab if you want to pursue medicine or pursue something else if you want to do hijab.
Yeah. And she said, and I told her I want to do surgery. She said, oh, especially surgery? I was like, don't even think about it.
Wow. Was she a surgeon herself?
No, I think she was a family medicine doctor.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that was my introduction into, if you want to do medicine and now that you've made the decision that you want to wear your hijab and you want to have a family, yeah, this is what you're up against.
So you have that big question from your grandma. You have, of course, your own values and wanting to pursue your dream without sacrificing your religion. But then you have someone that have gone through the process and is telling you you can't do it without taking off your hijab.
Yep.
What do you do? How do you process that?
I said, tawakkaltu ala Allahi wa kafa billahi wakilan, right? I put my trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and if it's meant to be, it'll be. If I'm meant to go to medical school, if I'm meant to become a surgeon, if I'm meant to wear my hijab, if I'm meant to have kids, it's going to happen, right? It's just going to be more challenging, but if Allah has written it, nobody can get in the way.
There you go.
So that was how I prepared myself to go to college.
MashaAllah. How do you respond to her? Did you just stay quiet and you were like, okay, I'm going to do it?
I'm a high school kid, right? I'm a high school kid. I'm like, oh, this doctor is telling me I can't do it. And I either have to give up my hijab, give up having kids, or give up medicine. I can't have it all. Wow. And so I said, okay. And then I shut down. And then I just, keep thinking to myself, and I said, my AA gave me the one question that I needed is whose permission do I need? And there's nobody more powerful than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? 100%. If Allah wills it, nobody can say anything to stop it.
Right. Wow. Okay. So you soldier on. What happened next?
So I soldier on. I go to college.
Yeah.
And I'm taking all the pre-med classes. And I don't know are you in medicine, first of all?
No, I'm not. No.
Okay.
I love medicine. I love talking to doctors, but myself, no.
Okay. So pre-med people, I don't know if you've ever met them, are the most competitive people on earth. They are gung-ho.
I heard organic chemistry is the valley of death.
Yes, it is very, very competitive. Cutthroat, very cutthroat. And so I'm in an organic chemistry class. And we're discussing, what it is that you want to do. And I'm like, all I know is I want to go to medical school. I want to become a surgeon. What kind of surgeon, what do I want to do the next 10, 15 years? I have no clue. I'm just now learning there are, in addition to your regular degree, there are pre-med requirements that you have to take, right? If those courses are not part of your requirement for your degree, you have to take them in addition. Right. And you have to take something called the MCAT, right? Medical college's admission test. I'm like, what is it? I'm learning everything as I go. Right. Wow. And then, after you graduate from medical school, you're not even guaranteed to become a doctor. You have to go apply to a residency. And after they train you as a resident, then you're a doctor. So I'm learning the entire process.
Yeah.
As I go through it. Right. And there's somebody in my organic chemistry class, and we're having discussion of what do you want to do, blah, blah, blah. And this guy says he wants to be the chairman of surgery or the chairman of internal medicine in the department of some big name at this institution.
Very specific. He narrowed it down. Wow.
He knows exactly what he's going to do 20 years from then.
Wow.
Yeah. And at this point, I'm like, what did I get myself into? And who am I up against? Right? Who am I up against? This is my competition. These are people who know people, who have connections, who their path is clear cut. They can see 20 years down the road. And I'm figuring out.
And you're walking in the dark room with no map.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whew.
Yeah.
Man, yeah. Talk about unfair advantage.
Very
Yeah.
unfair advantage. So then it's like, okay, do I just give up and say, oh, they have an unfair advantage, they're gonna get in, I'm not, let's see what else I can do? Or do you
Right.
say, okay, how do I give myself an advantage?
Mm.
Right? You have to recognize that you're on an level playing field, right? This is not a level playing field. And so you can either say, okay, you know what, it is what it is, life's not fair, I leave. Or I say, okay, how do I, how do I change the odds to my favor?
Mm. I'm guessing you did the latter because you wouldn't be here if you did the former.
That
Yeah.
is correct. That is
Yes.
correct. So I found myself in one of the advisors' offices. There's like a big advisor office, and they have a bunch of resources for summer programs, scholarships, and this and that. I became a frequent flyer there. I would just come there, ask questions, go through their catalogs. And it was my freshman year. I did college in 3 years. So in high school, I did a bunch of AP exams. I took AP classes, which are called advanced placement classes, where you can take college level classes, take tests, get college credit, right?
Wow.
So I came to college with a year, like over a year of college credits.
Wow.
Right.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I had 3 years to get my degree and apply to medical school. And so I did that. So my first year, which is my freshman year, was actually my sophomore year.
Mm.
I had all the credits, but I'm advanced, but at the same time I'm behind because I have time. I don't have much time to figure out how do I make myself prepared to apply for medical school the next year.
I see. Yeah.
Right? I literally have 2 years to learn how the system works and to get ready to apply for medical school.
We have less time to make mistakes, less time to figure things out, less time to experiment. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
So I went to these advisors' offices and I sat down and I basically got this big folder that had all these opportunities. And I found an opportunity where there was a summer program that was in Houston. So I went to college in Austin. University of Texas in Austin. So I found a program that was at where I ended up doing my residency at Baylor and Rice University, one of the major colleges in Houston, that they were doing a summer program that was like a mini medical school over the summer. And it was a paid opportunity. And I got to go home to my parents, right? And so I found that opportunity. I said, okay, sign me up. I signed up for it. I went, I did that program. That was the summer between my first year of college and my second year. My second year, I came back. I was like, I have to do research. I have to bulk up my resume, right? So I found a research opportunity that I did it for free for I think a couple of semesters, and then I got a scholarship to do it for the semesters after that. And then by that time, I was like, okay, I have a summer program that I did. I have research. Now I can apply for medical school. And so that's what I did to kind of bulk up my resume to be a better candidate, because I didn't have the connections and I didn't have, all the other things.
All the other stuff. But you knew at this point at least what it takes to get there. So you searched out there, you spent extra time, you invested extra time in finding those resources and taking advantage of them. That's good. That's good. Yeah, I'm very glad that you shared that, because I think there are maybe a lot of people who are going through the process right now, and I know it's probably slightly different, but it's still, just because you're not from the right background or because you don't have the right connections, that does not mean a completely shut door.
No, you just have to be resourceful, and you have to figure out, okay, you have to ask a lot of questions. You have to knock on a lot of doors. You'll get a lot of no's, but all you need is one yes.
There you go. There you go. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Okay. So then what happened next? We're just going to keep on this until you're in the room operating on people. That's where I've headed.
So then now I have to apply to medical school, and applying to medical school, I'm getting ready for my MCATs. I'm studying my MCATs and, doing a bunch of tests, and it's my last year. And so I've been doing research for, this is another challenge that came up.
Okay.
I never foresaw, coming, and nothing could have prepared me for this. So I did research for, I guess, a year and a half or 2 years by now, right? I did like almost a year of free research, and then I did, a scholarship. Now I'm focusing on applying to medical school. right? I have to get ready for the MCATs, take it again if I have to, if I don't do well, I'm planning for all these scenarios. And so I have, and I have limited time. So I go to the lab, the principal investigator of the lab, and he said, I've done a lot of time here, I'm grateful for the opportunities. And it was a thing where they were trying to get me to go the PhD route. They're like, you're doing a good job, you should, and I was finishing in 3 years, right? So they're like, don't go to medical school, go to the PhD route, stay in the lab. And I'm like I like instant gratification, right? I want to operate on somebody and see the result. I don't want to do bench, research for years. And maybe 20 years, I'll see the results, right?
Wow. Yeah, that makes sense.
And so, so I told him, I don't know if this is going to be doable, but I made my decision. I'm going to apply to medical school, right? I know I'm a little bit behind, but I did the research. I did the summer programs. I took a bunch of extra classes. My GPA is really good. I'm gonna apply. And so in doing that, I needed to take a step back from the lab, right? And they'd already written me my letter of recommendation. I'm doing the next step in my career trajectory. Right. And the principal investigator says, I'm taking back my letter of recommendation.
Oh, wow. Okay.
He said, I expected you to be in my lab until you finish. But, obviously you don't need me anymore. So the letter of recommendation I'm taking back. And he said, you're lucky I'm not calling all these schools that you're applying to and telling them that you're unreliable. Oh, this is someone I did research for free research for a year.
Just because you are leaving, he is acting in this way to sort of like try his best, I guess, to block your way to your next move. Yeah. That is, wow.
And this is like a grown professor threatening a 20, I think I'm like 21, 22 at the time, 20-year-old.
What do you do? Who do you talk to? Who
do you tell? Right? Like who do you report to? A fully grown professor who brings money, who brings research money to the institution, and me, who's just I was going to the school for with a scholarship. I'm not giving them any money, right? Yeah. And so it's like, okay, who's valuable to us? Who do you tell? And so it crushed me. I was like, oh my God, at first I thought, okay, me getting into medical school is an uphill battle to begin with, because I'm so behind. And now I have someone who's actively threatening to call the schools that I'm applying to say, don't admit her. And the one letter of recommendation that I had from the research that's on my resume, he's trying to take it back.
Wow. Okay. That's a hard one. A lot of people would walk away like, screw you and medical school and everything, and go on another path. But again, you didn't do that. Yes.
I walked away from the lab. If you're going to threaten me, then why would I keep putting myself in that situation? Right. That situation, alhamdulillah, had happened because it showed me his true colors. Right. So I said, you know what? Sometimes bad things happen like this on purpose. They happen for a reason. So I said, okay, I took a step back from the lab. I finished. And then I focused on getting ready for my MCATs and applying to medical schools. And at the time, it was very competitive and you had to apply to 10, 15. And I was at a point where I didn't think I had a chance to get into medical school. And this was going to be my trial. I was like, I'm finishing college in 3 years anyway.
Right.
I may need to give myself a gap year. So I'm gonna go on interviews. I literally, this was my practice run.
Wow.
And I applied to.
Think you're gonna get it. It's like, let me just try and see what happens, sort of thing.
Yeah, I applied to, and I was like, okay, if this is just a trial, right? I'm not gonna spend time and money going, across the country. I already know I didn't feel myself comfortable to be a good candidate. Like my resume was good, but I wanted it to be better. Right? I wanted it to be so much more.
You spend so much time with who's not supporting you anymore. So that is no longer, I guess, something that you can claim. Yeah.
Right. So I said, okay, I'm going to just stay in state. I'm going to apply to three medical schools in Texas. See what I get. If I get an invitation for an interview, alhamdulillah, that's going to be my practice interviews.
Good.
And then I'm going to try again next year. That was my plan.
Okay.
I applied to 3 medical schools. I got invitation to interview from 2 of them. And so I went to interview for those 2.
Thinking it was a trial. Yeah.
It was a trial. One of the schools, it wasn't the worst interview I've ever had. It was maybe the second or third.
Okay.
This interviewer, I had one good interview. It was a guy who was like, "Oh, your resume is great. You've done a good job. Why do you want to be a doctor?" And I told him about my story and blah blah blah. And he's like, "Oh, yeah, well, that's amazing. You actually want to do surgery because you've seen it?" And like, yeah. And so it was like, "Okay, you're a great candidate." The same school, I'm being interviewed by a woman. She's a pathologist. Her background is she is an Egyptian, like Orthodox Christian.
Interesting. Okay.
And she nitpicks my resume. I think I had like 1 B, I think. She's like, "Why do you have a B?" So technically, if you get invited for an interview, it means that your transcript and your resume, everything has is good. They're interviewing you to make sure you're a normal person and there's someone that can be trusted to take care of patients.
Right. They're questioning your academics and your background of what you've done.
So all those things have passed. Now it's getting to know you, who you are. Are you someone that we feel is going to be a good doctor? Right. This woman nitpicked my transcript. "Why do you have a B in this class?" I'm like, "It's the 1 B I had in my entire college year."
Wow.
It's like, interesting. And then she starts talking about my hijab. She said, "I have a lot of Muslim friends. I grew up in Qahira.
Yeah.
I have a lot of Muslim friends, and the hijab. You don't even know how to wear your own. It's a cultural thing. It has nothing to do with religion."
She's not Muslim, so who is she there?
Right? So I'm sitting there thinking, okay, I'm here to be interviewed on me becoming a doctor.
Right.
I don't understand what my hijab has anything to do with it. So and you can't say that out loud because this person is interviewing you, right? And so I don't even have words to say. I just sit there and like nod my head and say, okay. And then I shut down. I had, I prepared to have an interview where I ask questions. They ask me questions, and it's a back and forth, right? The guy who just interviewed me, that guy, perfectly fine, right? This woman, right now is specifically focused on my hijab.
Wow.
And so I got out of there, and the group of pre-meds that are gung-ho are all talking about, my interviewer asked me, if you had 2 patients and one was this age and the other one was this age and they had the same problems, how they got clinical scenarios to test their thinking and how they would treat different scenarios.
Wow.
I got asked about my hijab.
And you were like, I was there protecting my hijab the whole time.
Yeah, I'm like, and it's not even protecting. It's someone like just attacking you out of nowhere, telling you you don't know how to practice your own religion, right? So she personalized a professional interview, and so I was like, okay. So in an interview, if you're gonna come at me for my hijab and for who I am, then I don't even feel comfortable coming here as a student,
right?
And so, but I'm like, who am I to decide? It's only one out of 2 interviews.
Yeah. Wow.
Right. Okay. And then I went to my second interview. So the second school that was interviewing me, and this was UTMB Galveston, right? And it was different. It was people who actually were more interested in learning about who I am and what I wanted to do, and why medicine and why surgery and my experiences growing up in Somalia, and like really getting to know you, what motivated you to become a doctor. And I was like, oh my God.
About your hijab.
Yeah.
No questions about your hijab this time around.
No questions about my hijab.
Good. Good.
And I was like, okay, you know what? And I loved their program, the way it was structured. It was just, really beautiful. All the students there were really happy with the program. I mean, it was a medical school by the beach. It was beautiful.
Nice.
And so I left there thinking, you know what? I'm gonna double down on, my MCAT score was good, but I wanted it to be better. Like I had this, this perfectionist thing, right?
Wow.
But I was like, no, I want to get a full ride scholarship to medical school. I convinced myself I'm not getting in, right? And I said, next year, this is what I'm doing. I'm going to do everything that I can to get into this college. I went home. I didn't tell anybody when the results were coming out. So there's this match program. Do you know about the match program?
Match program, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So all these people apply to, all these medical schools. Medical schools interview all these people. And so you rank, right? You rank 1, 2, 3, like people interview at 20 something schools. And so they rank 1 through 20. I had 2.
And the ranking was very clear. Yeah.
I had 2. I was like UTMB. And then the other people, I have no option but to rank them. If I get in, I guess I can go through 4 years of, a racist place as long as I become a doctor. That was my thinking.
Wow.
Right. So UTMB and then UT Houston. And I don't tell anybody when the results are coming out because I'm expecting, next time around. Right.
Yes.
And so it comes out midnight. So I'm up midnight, waiting, refresh. And then I get accepted to UTMB Galveston.
You're refreshing the computer midnight. So if no one else in your family, your friends know this is happening.
Nobody knows.
Yeah.
Oh, I celebrated.
Yeah.
I found out, I told my parents, I said, I'm going to go to my AA's house. And at midnight, I drove to my AA's house and I told my AAU.
There you go.
That's how I celebrated.
Oh my gosh. MashaAllah.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. That's such a beautiful, now it makes sense why you called your coaching Defiant, because I was like, your whole life, you lived through it.
All my life I've been fighting.
Wow. Okay. So this trial turned into really, surprise for you, full admission to this medical school that you loved.
Mm-hmm.
You spent the next 4 years there.
Mm-hmm.
And then you decided that you want to do trauma surgery while you were in medical school, at least because the first 4 years is general, right? After that, you applied to residence of what you want to specialize in. Yeah.
So the first 4 years of medical school is just you're learning. So the first 2 years is all the book stuff. You're learning all the physiology, anatomy and physiology, microbiology, pharmacology, all the ologies. You learn everything. And then the last 2 years of medical school, you're in the clinical setting. You're in the hospital. You're doing rotations. You go through family medicine, internal medicine, surgery, OB-GYN, psychiatry. So you go through all of these different rotations. Mm-hmm. Right. So the last 2 years, and then the last 2 years is what helps you decide what field you want to be in.
Got it.
Yeah.
The day you accepted and you started medical school, did you know what you were going to go into, or those rotations in the second 2 years are what helped you decide?
I decided, I actually applied into internal medicine. I was going to become an internal medicine doctor, and I was going to become a cardiologist.
Okay. It sounds like you've always been in a fork where you're like, this is what I'm going to do, or maybe this and that. Okay.
No, I wrote applications. I had interviews lined up. I was going to become an internal medicine doctor because I wanted to have kids and I didn't want to wait too long to have kids.
Okay. I'm going to let you tell us that story. So internal medicine for people.
This is going to be like a 2-hour episode. You know that, right?
I know. I hope you don't have hard stuff. I know we don't have that much time scheduled.
No, we got time. We got time.
Good. Okay. So you get into medical school. You have your hijab on. Now your second priority, all right, I guess one of your priority was also to have family, to have kids. You looked at the professions or the different paths medical doctors pursue, and you convinced yourself being internal medicine is the least, problematic for your other mission of having kids. So you were like, this is what I'm going to pursue. Yep. So how did that happen? And then where did the change happen? When did you like, okay, actually I can do both?
Yeah. So actually my transition into the hospital was a little challenging. And so the different rotations, you see how different attendings, those are, faculty, they treat different residents, right? Sometimes you get ignored. Sometimes you get, there's something called pimping, where they ask you questions in front of everybody and ridicule you if you get it wrong. So it was a very strange environment. And so it was like a culture shock. Sometimes it was very toxic. And so that's, you had to learn how to navigate that. And then when I was doing my surgery rotation, as much as I loved surgery, it wasn't very welcoming. It was very, very hostile. I remember, my first time getting into the operating room, we had a third year resident who was showing us around, right? You have to wear certain clothes. You have to cover your hair. And if you go into the operating room to scrub into a case, there's a specific way that you have to wash up, dry and glove up. So he was teaching us that. And so we're standing there learning all of this. We're all wearing scrubs, right? I'm wearing the appropriate scrub that you're supposed to wear. And we're standing in this hallway, and at the very end of the hallway, there's a nurse that's coming towards us. And she keeps saying, "You can't be here. You can't be here." And he's like, and the resident, he's a surgery resident. He's supposed to be there. He's teaching these medical students. And so he thinks she's talking to somebody else. And so he ignores her and keeps teaching us. She gets closer to us and she comes and zeroes in on me and she says, "You can't be here with that thing on your head."
Oh, wow.
Yeah. You're talking about my hijab.
Yeah.
And so I look at the resident. I'm like, okay, you're the leader who's supposed to show me where I'm going and where I'm not, where I'm supposed to go and where I'm not supposed to go. He takes the rest of the students and he says, "Come with me." And they go through the double doors, right? The double doors say no trespassing or, surgery only or something like that. They go through those doors and I'm stuck standing out here with the nurse telling me I can't go in.
And is she explaining further why you cannot go in?
No, she's like, "You can't wear this. You have to take it off."
Interesting. Wow. Okay.
And I said, well, I'm not taking it off, number one. Number two, I'm a medical student.
Yeah.
Like, I'm paying money to be here.
Right.
And nobody's paying me to be, I'm paying money to be here. And at this point, like, I know I want to be a surgeon, but I don't know. But this is like my future. In the back of my mind, this is my future workplace. And there's somebody standing here telling me I can't even go in there. And so at this point, I'm like, okay, why? He said, "You can't wear that. You have to take it off." He said, "Okay, I can't take it off. Then you have to wear a bunny suit." You know what a bunny suit is?
No. What is that?
It's this plastic thing. It's like a onesie, a onesie for kids.
Yes.
A onesie for adults. It's made of plastic or really, really tough, like a paper sometimes. And it goes over your clothes, your shoes, and it has a little cap and it closes up to here. And it is hot. And the operating room. Nobody else is wearing that. Nobody else is wearing that. She said, "I have to wear that."
Okay.
I said, I'm not wearing that. It's wearing the hijab by itself is hot enough already. And this is Texas. Okay. This is Texas. It's already hot. This is one of the oldest medical schools in the country. And they've never had somebody who needed to wear a hijab in the operating room. Wow. And so I said, "That's not an option. I'm not doing that." And she's shocked. She's like, "You can talk to me like that?" I said, it's not an option. I'm not wearing that. He said, where is the policy that says I can't wear this? And she's like, I'm like, is there a policy that's written that says you can violate somebody's, like, this is a freedom of religion, right?
Right. Yes.
So that was my next question is, where's the policy that says I can't wear this? She doesn't have a policy to show me.
It's because she hasn't seen it before. She assumed you're not supposed to wear it.
Yeah. And she assumes that I will do whatever she says.
Right.
Yeah. But I'm no longer a high school kid, right? I'm not a college kid. I've been in medical school for 2 years, right? This is my third year. Yeah. I know my rights. So I stick to my guns. I said, no, I'm not wearing a bunny suit and I'm not taking it off. That's not an option. Is there a policy that dictates what I can and cannot do? No. I said, okay, then I have a solution. When you're in the operating room, the most important thing is that your hair is covered, right? This is the most covered you could get.
Right.
So I said, the problem is the cloth moha. I will stick it, all these loose ends. Yeah, I'm going to stick it under my scrubs.
Yeah.
You want me to wear a hat, the blue hat, so I could fit in with everybody? I'll put a blue hat on top. It makes zero sense. It makes zero sense.
Because you already have, I'm not sure what, a better one maybe, but yeah.
But for conformity's sake, I said, just to get her off my back so I can go back to doing my work, I said, I will put this here. This is tucked in. What's the problem now?
Right.
And she's like, I said, okay. Because I'm paying money to be there. It's not they're not doing me a favor.
Right.
Right? So she's like, okay, I guess that works. I said, okay, what's the policy? Is there a policy for this? No. I said, okay, who's the charge nurse? Who writes the policies for this? Okay, maybe we create a policy because I'm not going to be the only person, right? There's going to be other students who are also Muslim women who wear a hijab.
And who would probably not question who would probably not question it when they're told you they cannot be here. Yeah. Nobody questions it, right? They're like, oh, these are fake rules. People just make up rules as they go, right? And you're just supposed to follow it. They said, no. How about we create a policy? Oh, that's a wonderful idea. Yeah, it's a wonderful idea. Right. Good.
Yeah. So we created that policy, and it was no longer a problem. Wow. And so that was my introduction to surgery, is that it is a very hostile place. And, it doesn't matter, it's not even, why are you wearing this? What is the purpose of it? What is the relevance of it? Oh, you're not allowed. You can't go someplace. A place that you are paying money to be in. Somebody's going to come and tell you, no, you can't be here.
And you'll be like, you know what? This is so interesting. I want to be surgeon. This place is so invited. They like me. Yeah.
No, like at that point, it really made surgery unappealing to me.
It would.
It's like you mean to tell me, like, I'm going to come to work every day just to fight with people? Like, I don't want to do that.
So you put this policy in place to allow yourself inside, and hopefully anyone who will come behind you. Yep. But it's still, you didn't pursue surgeries. You said you want to do internal medicine. Talk us through that.
So my last, I think it was like at the end of my third year, that's when you apply a year ahead to the program, so you can have a year to interview and decide on whatnot. And so I applied to all the internal medicine programs. I wanted to do something hands-on. So I said, I'm going to do internal medicine, 3 years of internal medicine, 3 years of cardiology, and then a year or two of interventional cardiology, so I can do like cath and things like that. I want to work with my hands. I see. And so, but I still loved surgery. I said, I'm going to get it out of my system. Right. So I sign up to do this, like one of the hardest rotations in surgery, which is vascular surgery. Like, people block it off and say absolutely not. Like when you're choosing your rotations, people say absolutely not vascular surgery. So they rarely have people, students volunteering to do that. I put it as number one. I was like, I want to do it.
What do you do? What is that surgery?
So vascular surgery is people who have peripheral artery disease, like their blood vessels get clotted. And so you have to do bypasses, and you're operating on vessels.
And you put a stents in them?
So you can, there's endovascular stents, but the procedures that I loved were open, like where you cut open the blood vessel, and then you take clots off of it, and then you sew it back up, or there's a huge blockage that you can't open up, so you create a bypass from one area to another.
I see.
To bypass that block. Yeah, it's very fascinating. It's fascinating. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna do that rotation. Like, I love surgery. I'm going to do like the toughest one that I thought at the time, right? Like, I've seen it and I loved it. And so I did that rotation. You're there 5 o'clock in the morning, you round and see patients. You're in the operating room by 7:30. You're operating until 10, 11 p.m. Right? You go and see your patients afterwards. You go home, sleep for a few hours, come back and do it again. Right?
Wow. Okay.
I loved it. It was amazing. I remember one of the very first cases that I did, we had a patient who had low blood flow to his lower legs, and his toes died. He had diabetes, and so his toes died. And so he had 3 toes that were dead and that needed to be amputated. The faculty that I was working with, like, they loved me. Like, they would ask me questions, and I studied ahead of time so I would know all the answers. And so if I passed that bar, they're like, okay, now we can let you operate. Right?
Wow.
So
wow. Yeah.
So one of the first cases I did by myself was toe amputations. Right? He had like 3 dead toes that needed. And so the resident showed me one, And then the attending was like, let her do it herself. I said, okay. So I cut it. I stopped the bleeding. I had these little, they're called rongeurs, or bone cutters. You have bone cutters that you can, cut the bone, like you hear, you take it off.
Yeah. Wow.
Like I did the whole case. I finished it and I called my mom, like, oh, yo, guess what I did today? It's like, I cut off somebody's toe. She goes, "A'udhu billahi minash shaitan."
Yeah.
It's like, on purpose? And I said, yes, on purpose. She's like, why? And why are you happy about it?
Wow. I can just picture that conversation. Wow.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But it was so exhilarating. It was so exciting. Like you're actually getting to do things. You're taking something that's dead off of a patient's, body, and it's going to make them better. Like it was infected. It was making him sick. Right. And so you're actually doing something to help someone. Wow. It was so exciting. And then there were other cases. So once I got to do that, we were doing a case where we were doing bypass on both sides, on the big vessels. Right. And so these are things that you do as a resident, as a third year, fourth year resident, not as a medical student.
Wow.
Right.
Okay.
Before I did this rotation, I went to the cath lab, to the cardiologists, and I asked them, hey, I'm interested in interventional cardiology. Can I scrub into a case? And what they do in those procedures is that big vessel that we were opening and operating on in vascular surgery. Yeah. They poke a needle through it and they put catheters and wires in there.
I see.
Okay, so the skin is closed. They just put a needle in it and they put catheters and wires and they shoot dye and they take x-rays, right? And so I asked them, can I scrub in and can I stand next to you when you do that? They're like, no. Stand all the way over there and look through the window. They wouldn't even let me scrub in to watch them poke a hole in this needle, poke a needle into this big vessel. And now I'm in the operating room with a vascular surgeon, right? With a chief resident, and he's operating on one side and the attending is on the other side doing something else. And she goes, Qaali, have you ever done this procedure before? I'm a medical student. I've never done this. The chief resident shuts me up and he says, yes, she has.
Oh, okay.
And I'm like, John, he's like this guy named John.
Yeah.
He's one of the best residents I've ever worked with. And I'm like, he goes, shh. He's like, yes, she has. He hands me the instruments and he says, do everything I do on this side. It's the identical procedure, right? He said, watch me do this. You do it on that side. I'm like, oh my God.
Oh my God.
So
Yeah.
I get my instruments. I start, dissecting, put a loop around it, expose it. We open it up, clamp. Beautiful. Like every step he did, I did the exact same.
First time.
As a medical student. And like my whole body, I'm like, my head, that emoji?
Yes. Head exploded, yeah.
My head is literally exploding. I'm like, oh my God. Like just, a month before, the cardiology people refused to let me stand next to them.
You had to watch from
a needle.
Yeah.
Yeah, they said, go watch over there from that window. And I'm in the operating room. An attending is somewhere over there. I think she's looking. We were going to bypass from the groin to the leg. And she's working on the leg, on the smaller vessels, getting those out. Me and the chief resident are working on the big vessel. They trusted me to handle a big vessel by myself as a medical student. Wow. And I'm sitting here like, is this, am I being punked? Like, is this happening? Is this real?
That's really
and we did it. And I was like, oh my God. Like this could be my life. I could be doing something like this every day. And that's when it hit me. It said, oh, what am I doing? What am I compromising? But I was like, well, you know what? At this point in my life, I want kids more than I want to be a surgeon. But we did the procedure. We finished it. We did the bypass. It was amazing. Afterwards, John was he was a resident. He was a chief resident who's married, had 4 kids. And the school, like the medical school and the hospital are right next to each other. And there's a huge library that's right in front of the hospital. His wife used to bring the kids and he would play with them while he was at work.
Oh, wow.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I'm like, he's a guy. He has a wife at home. Of course he can do that. But he sat me down. He goes, Qaali, I haven't seen your application come through our program. Are you applying to our residency program? I said, no, I'm applying to internal medicine. I already have interviews. Yeah.
Yeah, because I want to have life.
Yeah, I said I want to have kids, and surgery. I don't see having children as a surgeon. He goes, Ali, you're a surgeon. Said, I don't say this to any medical student. You're a surgeon. You're a freaking surgeon. So, what are you doing? I said, no, I really want to have kids. And he said, okay, listen, this is what I want you to think about. He said, residency is going to suck no matter what you do. Residency is going to be terrible, right? If you do internal medicine or if you do surgery, it's going to be terrible. And he said, you want to do what? Cardiology? Yeah. That's longer than being a surgeon. You're going to do 3 years of internal medicine, 3 years of cardiology fellowship. That's already 6 years. And you're going to do a fellowship. Yeah. You're going to be a surgeon by the time you're a cardiologist who can't even do procedures. I was like, I didn't even think about it that way. And he goes, he said, listen, don't make a decision because of residency. Make your decision based on what you want to do for the rest of your life. Residency is a finite amount of time. It's going to end, whether it's 3 years, 6 years, 5 years, it doesn't matter. It's going to come to an end, and it's going to be terrible while you're doing it. But afterwards, what do you want to be? Like lifestyle, he said, lifestyle, and this is one of the best things he said, lifestyle is whatever you make it. That you can be an internal medicine doctor who works harder than a surgeon, or you could be a surgeon who has the hours of of a family medicine doctor or a dermatologist.
Wow.
So you could do whatever it is that you want. Lifestyle is what you make it, when you make it. But what is it that you want to wake up doing every day? I was like, dang it.
Good question. Yeah.
Very good question, right?
Yes.
So I went home. I rewrote my personal statement. I sent a bunch of emails to the people who invited me for an interview for internal medicine. I said, thank you for the opportunity, but I'm going to be a surgeon.
Look at that. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. And the rest is history.
I'm a surgeon. Look. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I don't think we have time to do step by step of that, because I would love to. Maybe we should do episode 2. I think we should do episode 2. It's going to be episode 1. Maybe you can visit us in the Twin Cities.
Inshallah. Inshallah, yeah. I actually do have a project coming up. I have been working on a book.
Nice. Nice.
Yeah.
Yes. What is it called? Do you have a name for it?
We haven't finalized the title yet. We're in the process, but it's gonna have defiance. It's on being defiant.
There. Yeah.
Yeah. It's gonna be on being defiant and creating the life and career that you want.
Okay. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna skip the second part and go to you doing fellowship, you become an actual attendant, and then having kids while you did it, and how you manage that part. And then we can conclude, the Defiance Academy, because I want to make sure we get some time for that as well. So when do you start having kids, and how do you manage that part? And do you start that in residence or in fellowship, or you waited until you were done with all of those? How did that work?
I had my first kid my intern year.
First year of residence.
First year of residency. My second kid, my second year. My third kid, my fourth year of residency. I had my twins, my chief year. And my baby, my fellowship year.
Oh my God. Wow.
You're gonna need like an episode 2 and episode 3.
There must be. There has to be. Yes. Wow. Every year of residence, you had a kid.
Almost. Third year, I didn't have a kid.
Yes.
I made up.
I
had twins my chief year.
Wow. Wow.
And then my intern year, this is where I got married right between graduating from medical school to starting residency. Right, I graduated from medical school. I got married. And like a month later, I started residency. And then 3 months into residency, I find out I'm pregnant with my only girl. I have 5 boys and 1 girl.
Wow.
And when I'm having this discussion, as soon as I find out I'm pregnant, I'm like, okay. One of the things I didn't ask during residency was, what's maternity leave policy? Because I just wanted to get in, right? it's I wasn't residency. I did the same thing. I didn't apply to a whole bunch of places. I kind of stayed within Texas. Actually, no, I didn't stay within Texas. I applied to a few areas. I went to 2 cold places, and then I canceled the rest of my cold place residency interviews, and then I focused on Texas. But yeah, so those that was a question that I never asked. But I found out when I was pregnant with my first child, that our program didn't have a maternity leave policy. Nobody ever got pregnant in the program and actually stayed. Women waited until they were chief residents, until they were almost done to get pregnant, right? And then by the time they needed to deliver, they were done. They didn't need time off, right? And so when I tell my advisor or my boss, hey, I know it's early and I should probably wait until I'm second trimester, but I kind of need to plan. What am I doing? And he was like, well, you're done. You chose motherhood over becoming a surgeon, so yeah, I mean, you're done. So look for internal medicine or family medicine or what other family-friendly, programs there are out there. But it's never been done, and it will never be done. The most he's like you're only an intern. The most junior resident to ever attempt having kids in this program was a 3rd-year resident. So she's been here for 3 years, right? And I'm still waiting for her to come back from maternity leave, and that was 6 years ago.
Oh my God.
And then the culture, it was so ingrained even in the women that I had a chief resident, a woman, come to me and tell me, Qaali, can you believe there's an intern who's pregnant? Can you believe her?
You're like, hey.
I was like, oh my God, I can't believe it. How dare she?
Oh my God. But at that point, you were like, hey, I have some expertise in policy change.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what happened? What do you do?
So basically, I was like, okay, where's our maternity leave policy? And he's like, it doesn't exist.
I was waiting for that question. Yes.
Yeah. I was like, okay. And at the time, I wasn't the only one pregnant. A year later, or a few months later, I think, one of the chief residents was pregnant.
Okay.
And so I was like, okay, she's probably going to have her kid before she finishes. We need a maternity leave policy. And he was like, okay, create one. I said, okay. So we looked around, and the OB-GYN department was the only other department that had one. So
wow. So
we're like, okay, we're going to copy this. So we got their
Baylor.
policy.
Baylor.
Yep.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So we copied theirs, and it ended up just being your vacation time and your sick time is what you got for maternity leave. Any time outside of that you needed, it was unpaid leave.
And then do they also deduct it from your residence? Does that mean if you take more time, you have to add to that?
Yep. Yeah.
Wow. Double burn. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was it. No new introduced maternal policy? They just said you can take your own personal and sick leaves for that.
No, so that was the maternity leave policy. We incorporated it. We said, okay, now we can take time off. And then there were changes happening with the American Board of Surgery who has to certify the time that we trained. And so they've made some changes as to, okay, instead of requiring 52 weeks of certain or 50 weeks of training, you can have like 48 or something like that. So we've made some changes. So we incorporated that into the policy, right? But after I finished, 2 years after I've been out, one of my colleagues is still at Baylor, and every few years she would call me and give me an update on what's going on with the program. So the first 2 years after I finished, she called me and she said, "There's a class. It is 4 women and 1 man. 4 of the women are pregnant all at the same time."
Wow! Look at that. Man.
She said, the people who are running things here really don't like the culture that you've created here. I said, it's doable. And then I think 2 years later after that, she called me and she said, the maternity leave program that they have right now is one of the best in the country. They get 7 weeks of paid maternity leave.
MashaAllah, look at that. when you're defiant, things happen, you know?
Whether they like it or not.
Yeah, yeah. Look at that. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, America should be thankful to you because there is a decline of babies and we need more of them. Yeah.
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 I did my
Wow.
part. I have 6. That's it.
You have done you not only your part of having 6, but also, paving the road for more people. Look at that, 4 women after you are also pregnant. That's wow. That's impressive. Okay. 6 kids, 4 years of residence done, and then you were like, I'm not done. You end up doing fellowship.
Yeah, so I went out into the workforce. Like I finished it's 5 years of general surgery residency. So I finished and I went out and looking for a job, and the job market is terrible for general surgeons. It was just terrible, terrible, terrible. And so at that point, when I'm looking for a job for residency after residency is when I find out I'm pregnant with twins. Yeah.
Is having twins a thing in your family?
Yeah, my dad is a twin. My sisters are twins. One of my sisters, who actually lives in Minnesota, has triplets.
Oh my God! Wow,
Yeah,
mashallah.
she's a
That's
twin.
She's a twin herself.
She's a twin herself, and she had triplets. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I find out I'm pregnant with my twins, and so I was gonna do this really so at that time I decide, okay, I'm gonna do a fellowship. I don't like the job market. I'm gonna stay and do a fellowship. And when I'm thinking of doing a fellowship, there's a program that I wanted to do in where is it? It was Oregon. Yeah, there's a program that I wanted to do in Oregon. But then right before I apply to that program, I find out I'm pregnant with twins. And so I'm like, okay, I know my program. I'm familiar with the people. I decide to stay. I said, okay, I'm going to do my fellowship here. And then I have my twins. At the end, I finish my chief year. I have my twins, and I have to make up 3 months for the 3 kids that I already had, right? My intern baby, my second year baby, and my 4th year baby. I have 3 months to make up. And so I make up those 3 months. I take time off. I do some extra work. I have my twins, and then I come back and do my fellowship year in critical care, and then I have my fellowship baby.
Fellowship baby. Fellowship baby. There you go. Yeah.
So I had my fellowship baby, and then I went out to look for a trauma job after that.
And you're still in Texas. You're still in the place that you grew up. You spent all those years in.
Yep.
Are you still there? Do you still live there?
I'm in Arizona.
Okay, another one place. Yeah, nice.
Another one
So
place. Actually, I went from Texas to Florida to now Arizona.
you don't want to come to Minnesota.
My husband is from Minnesota.
There you go. Is your
My
husband
husband's from
Somali?
Minnesota. I went to interview at Mayo for residency right before we got married. That was the one compromise. I said, I'm going to interview at Mayo Clinic in Rochester. And I went in to he drove me there. I went in to interview. It was cold and raining outside. I came back. Everything was covered in snow.
That's
And
Minnesota
I
for
said,
you.
I, I said, I give you a chance. I interviewed. This is not going to work.
This is not it. Yeah. Wow. Wow. Well,
But he's like the change. I remember when he first came to Houston, it was December, and he looked around. He was like, "There's palm trees. There's palm trees, and it's 75 degrees in Houston in December."
yeah.
So yeah, he was hooked.
You should convince every Somali who lives in Minnesota to move there because I never understand it. I'm here.
Why are
and I
you
never
still there?
understand it. In the winter, every winter I say this is my last winter in Minnesota. I'm gonna move out. And
It's
then summer comes around and it's beautiful and there's all these people and it kind of reminds me of Somalia. You have all the Somalis community that we have here. But if we could move it to another place, I would 100% be down for that.
You know which weather reminds me of Somalia? Arizona.
Oh,
Arizona.
Arizona, really? Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's
okay.
beautiful. It's very dry heat. Very, very dry heat, but it's
We should
it's
put an
very
announcement
nice.
out there. Well, all Somalis, please start moving to Arizona.
That's my public service announcement. Is
There you go.
move
Yeah.
away from Minnesota.
I'll volunteer to be there. One of the first. Yeah. That's great. So that's where you got your first full-time job after fellowship
In Florida. Yep.
in Florida. And then you moved back to Arizona. You live there now. Okay. Before we end it, you have 6 kids now. You have a trauma surgeon, but you also talk about how, to balance life and have your family and have your career, and not only that, but write a book and coach other women. How many of you out there? How do you do this?
That's a very good question, and that's the thing that I teach in Defiance Academy is, one of the things that we are taught as women, and this comes from how we're raised, is to this concept of being a superwoman and doing it all, right? We're taught that having it all, when we talk about having it all, it's always applied to women. Nobody ever says, a man who wants to, if a man says, hey, I want to become a doctor, I'm like, oh yeah, oh, what about family? How can you do it? You want to do it all, right?
Yes.
Right. So that concept, that idea of wanting to do it all is applied to women and never men, because of a basic understanding. And that basic understanding that everybody knows it, but nobody says it out loud, is that in addition to having a career, you're also going to be expected to carry on your responsibility at home as if you were a stay-at-home mom. Right? So if you want to have kids, right? It's not, oh, how are you going to get help so that you can do both? It's how are you going to do both? Right? And so I've been studying, like I burned out. Like my first year in practice, you think the challenges that I went through in residency and medical school are bad. Like I haven't even told you about my first year of being in practice and how I almost quit, because I got all the credentials. I got, all the training, and I'm like this double board certified trauma surgeon. I couldn't even get people to take care of my patients who were dying because nobody saw me as a leader. Nobody respected, my authority and my position. And on top of that, I couldn't negotiate getting a flexible work schedule with 6 kids at home, right? So I did all the hard work. I followed all the advice. I went above and beyond. And my first year in practice, I can't even do my job. I don't have the flexibility that I need, right? And I'm burning out. So hard work, work hard and you will succeed is advice that we get all the time, especially women, especially Black women, especially Muslim women, right? We're all told, and Black people in general, right? People of color in general, what is the most common advice we get? You have to work twice as hard to get half as far.
Yes.
Right?
That's true. Yes.
And so I was in a position where my first interview in a job, and I haven't even told you the story yet, is, I'm being interviewed. And the moment I bring up job flexibility, the chairman who's interviewing me throws my resume across the table and says, you've accomplished nothing over the past 6 years. The very thing that I was told was impossible my intern year. It's impossible. It's never been done. It'll never be done. 6 years later, when I do the impossible, and I not only have one kid, I have multiple kids, my resume gets thrown across the table and I'm told you've accomplished nothing. So after my first year of going through all of this and saying, okay, I did all the hard work, I paid my dues, right? I proved myself over and over and beyond, and I still cannot do my job. I still am not experiencing the fruits of I'm not enjoying the fruits of my labor. I put in all this hard work and I'm burning out, and I'm at a point where I'm considering quitting a career I spent 15 years building. Right. And I went to a women in medicine conference in Chicago, and the woman that was talking, that was the keynote speaker, talked about, the pay gap, the leadership gap, the research funding gap, all the problems that women at the very top of the ladder were having. Right. And I'm here at the very bottom of the ladder. I just became an attending and I can't even stay on the ladder. I can't even get on the ladder. I had a hard time finding a job. Everywhere I would interview, like one, I got my resume thrown across the table. 2, multiple places told me, oh, how many kids do you have? Yeah, it's not going to be a cultural fit. We're a very busy surgical service here. It's not going to be a fit.
Oh my God.
Right? So I'm like, okay.
How many kids do you have in the interviews, or you volunteer that often?
I've always volunteered. And so that's another gap, right? I've had people who go to interviews, don't say anything, and then by the time they get a job, they go there, they tell them they have kids, and they start experiencing all this hostility. So for me, I've always brought it to the table.
I see.
Right? And that's on purpose. That's strategic for me.
Right.
Because if you're going to be, if you're not going to be, if that's not going to be okay with you, I want to know before I get into business with you. Right. But there are a lot of laws that protect that, but it's actually detrimental. Like that's a whole nother topic we can get into. And so Defiance came from the fact that I went to this Women in Medicine conference, and they're talking about all these things. And I stand up and I ask a question and say, okay, you know what? This is who I am. And I this is not new to me. I went through residency experiencing all the isms: racism, sexism, Islamophobia, pregnancy discrimination, all of that. But I paid my dues. I put my head down. I did the hard work. Now I'm an attending. I can't do my job. I am burning out. And, how do I lead in this situation? And the keynote speaker who was, conducting the Q&A said, I don't do race in front of everybody. It's public forum.
Wow.
And she said, that's the end of our Q&A. She's a DEI expert. She's a diversity, equity, and inclusion expert. She said, I don't do race. And so I'm like, okay, maybe she's uncomfortable answering publicly. So I approach her afterwards and say, no, really, this is a very common problem that, a lot of us are facing. What do we do? And she said, honestly, I don't do race. I don't discuss race. And she left. At least 15 women that doctors in the conference came to me and said, first of all, I can't believe she said that publicly. Second of all, what did she say to you in person? She said the exact same thing. And they're like, we came looking for the same answers because we're also going through the same thing. And so that's when I realized, number one, hard work will get you in the door, but it does not guarantee that you stay in that door, you stay in that room, that you succeed in that room, that you advance, that you even have opportunities. Okay. Hard work is the minimum. It doesn't get you anywhere else.
Wow.
And number two, nobody was addressing the issues that I was facing. Right. Every step of my journey, I had to be the one to fight back, right? To make the policy changes that I needed, to stand up for myself, to challenge, whatever, rules people wanted me to follow and say, that doesn't work. Now I'm in a place where, the people who are not listening to me, is it racism? Is it sexism? Is it Islam? I don't know what it is. Right. So do I go, accusing people and pointing fingers and saying you're treating me this way? Or do I take matters into my own hands and learn how to lead in the most hostile place possible? And so I literally sat down and journaled my entire journey and realized I've been defiant my whole life.
I've noticed that. I've seen the pattern very quickly. Yes.
Right.
Wow.
And that defiance actually, and the word defiance, I've had a lot of people fight me on using the word defiance, and I have to use the word defiant. And that idea, the concept actually comes from my grandmother. Right? Because she was one of the first people to ask me that question, is who are you waiting to give you permission? Right? Because when we wait for permission, women are taught to wait for permission and go along, when people tell us, oh, you can do it all, well, that means you can be, career driven, and you're also going to be responsible for the cooking and the cleaning and the laundry and this and that. And we said, okay, you want me to be a superwoman? Okay. All right. Oh. And that's compliance, right?
Not a defiant. Yes.
That's compliance. That's saying, okay, there are all these expectations put on us. You want us to do all of it. We've been compliant our whole lives. Right. Yeah. And my grandmother asking me that question of who are you waiting to give you permission created that idea of defiance. Like, I don't have to wait for permission. I don't have to ask for permission. I have to figure out what it is that I need, and I have to find a way to maneuver through it. And that's the idea that I took, and I looked at every challenge I have faced, every challenge I am facing in the workplace as a Black Muslim woman, as a mother, and every scenario I figured out how to negotiate, how to have the critical situation, critical conversations. Right? We're not taught to have critical conversations. Women, if we're confrontational, they call us a bitch. A man who's confrontational is, he's a leader, right? He's confident.
Yes, he's confident. There you go.
And so we are labeled completely different things for behaving the same way. Right? And so, and I was being...
There's a certain way that they expect you to behave in their head. And when you don't conform to that, all of those labels come around.
Yeah. My first year, I was getting written up day in and day out. Like, just like my male colleague surgeons, I would come in the room and ask, what's going on? Why is this patient like this? Why, what's happening? Do this, do this. One of my, there's a colleague who like throws things in the trauma bay. Doesn't get written up. I ask a question, I get written up. Right? So I had to find out, I have to lead differently. I'm in a hostile workplace. I can say the same exact things. I will get written up. My colleague will get praised. Right? So I had to learn how to lead differently. And so I developed over like a 3-year period, the Defiant Career Strategy, how we have to navigate every space that we occupy, whether it's in our home, in our communities, in the workplace, everywhere. Everything is negotiable, right? But we just have to carry ourselves differently, and we have to unlearn all the bad things that we were taught, being compliant, being okay with, being expected to do everything, right? We got a cute name, Superwoman, and we wear it as a badge of honor. I'm a superwoman. I'm doing it all. And what does that lead to? Burnout, right? Women are burning out at much higher rates than men. Women are leaving the workforce. Yeah. Growth. By the time you're in your career 10, 15 years, when your male colleagues are advancing and getting pay raises, women are burning out and leaving the workforce altogether. Right? You're taking care of aging parents, you're raising children, you're doing all these things. As you advance in your workplace, you're getting more responsibilities, right? Your plate just keeps piling on and piling on. And the expectation that you just do it all and have a smile on your face, that's why we burn out. Wow. And so my response to that is, it's impossible, it's unsustainable. We should not be required to be grateful for that. And Defiance says we understand, why we're in this situation. We understand how the system works. We understand that the workplace is not designed for us. The workplace never changed to accommodate women coming into the workplace, right? There's no flexibility. We're still getting paid less, all those things. And society never changed to accommodate women going into the workforce. They said, oh, you're going to the workforce? Yeah. You're also doing this job? Yeah. Wonderful. You're a superwoman. Yeah. So we're saying absolutely not. No, we're going to defy that idea, and we're going to pursue what it is that we want. We're going to be successful in our careers. We're going to take care of our family. We're going to, be there for them, but we're also going to prioritize our health and our sanity, right? And we're going to put boundaries that are defiant, and we say, no, we don't accept this kind of behavior. We don't accept. I will be confident. I will come to a trauma room. I will ask questions. I will be tough. If you're not doing the right thing, I'm going to call you out, and you're not going to write me up because this is my position as a trauma surgeon.
Wow. So by asking then women to be defiant, to challenge the status quo, to ask tough questions, to not behave the way they expected, is maybe also that working harder and working more, and because you are, in a way, you have to writing policies and challenging the system that exists and fighting it back is also a lot of energy and a lot of work.
It depends on how you use that energy, though, because we're already working harder, right? When you're expected to do all the things, and especially in the workplace, what a lot of women do is they overperform, right? They volunteer for a lot of things. A lot of things are put on their plate, and they see it as, oh, this is me paying my dues, and if I do this, I will be recognized. Okay. Like if you look at diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives that recently started, right? It was put on a lot of women's plates. Oh, here, we're doing diversity stuff. We're doing stuff for women. They're going to the meetings. They're doing all these things. They're doing all these projects. Those things are not weighed equally as the projects that their male colleagues are doing. They don't get the same recognition. They don't get the same raise. They don't get the same promotions. They're already working harder, and they're not getting, they're not getting rewarded for it. Defiance is actually the opposite. Defiance is knowing, okay, this I have to do, this I don't have to do, and I don't want to do. Defiance is understanding the reason why you're being asked to do certain things and whether you should be doing it or not. And defiance is having the strategy and the conflict resolution skills and the communication skills to say, this is a great project. You know who I think would be great for it? Yeah, so and so.
Right. Identifying who.
Right. And knowing the language and knowing, the communication skills, being a leader in places where you're not expected to be a leader. I remember there are times when I walk into a room and they're looking around and talking about who they're expecting to come. Oh, we're expecting Dr. Hussein. And they're looking at me like, who are you? like with a scowl, and I'm like, I am Dr. Hussein, and all of a sudden they change.
Yeah, wow. Because they don't picture you when they're thinking about a doctor.
Yeah,
that's fascinating. Wow. Okay, what does Defiance look like at home with 6 kids, with Muslim wife, a Somali of that? What does that look like?
Defiance looks like me not having to be the only person in the house that cooks. Me not being the only person in the house that cleans. Me not being the only person in the house that does laundry. We have a person who does laundry. It's his job. We have somebody who does, groceries come in and he knows where to put everything in. Defiance at home means I get to be home half the month, even though I work full time as a trauma surgeon. Defiance at home means I get to take my daughter to, she's in a speech and debate competitions, and she's competing in a national competition this year and international in November, inshallah, that I get to go and do those things, right? Yeah. Defiance means on my post-call days when I'm tired, my kids can feed me instead of me feeding them, right? Defiance means I can, instead of being too tired to do things with my kids, I can actually, have the presence and the energy to watch anime with them. There's like, how many anime shows there are?
So many.
Yeah. So they teach me all those things, and I'm present, and I'm not worried about, what's going on at work. Like I can be present. That's teaching my boys how to make anisha. They love they have it down. Yeah. Like my daughter made it the other day and they're like, this is not up to our standards.
Wow. I would say in the diaspora, hopefully it's changing, but back home, Somali boys were useless at home. No one asked them to do anything.
No, I have one daughter. I have one daughter and 5 boys, and for us, it was a challenge in our home, to create that. At first, when my daughter started helping me cook and clean, she was doing everything, and the boys, it's like they're just sitting down playing video games. And I went through that growing with brothers, and I didn't want that for my daughter, right? And so we've changed like that. We practice defiance in our household. My boys, they cook, clean. They're self-sufficient. If they go out to college, they're not going to be, helpless, right? They can feed themselves, they can cook for themselves, they can clean for themselves, right? These are life skills. We use it as a tradition of, boys don't go in the kitchen. Like, what are they going to do if they're out living by themselves?
Right.
It's a life skill. And the other thing, what I teach in Defiance, I teach my kids at home. These are life skills: how to speak up for themselves, how to advocate for themselves, how to not have people, bullshit them about, this is what the rule is, right? I'm going to tell you a funny story. So I've been teaching this for quite some time, right? And my kids, like when I'm teaching online, sometimes they'll sit in. I'm in my office right now, and there's a couch right there, and they'll sit there and be on their devices. And so they've heard all these things that I've been teaching. So in 4th grade, with my middle child, he was doing something, and him and his friends were standing around talking, and the teacher told him to be quiet. They still kept talking. She told him again. They still kept talking. So she called him out. She said, "Abdullahi, I need you." Like, they have this reward system. "I need you to give me 5 stars." And he was like, "Okay, what did I do?" She's like, "You guys are still talking. I need you to give me 5 of your stars right now." And he's like, "Okay, I'm gonna give it to you, but we're all talking. He's talking, she's talking, we're all talking. Are they gonna give you their stars, or is it just me?"
Practice and Defiant. That's cool.
Right? Like, don't just follow. Like, I teach my kids respect authority, but don't just blindly follow it. Right? Yeah. Like, always, like I teach my kids to stand up and advocate for themselves.
Wow.
And so she's like, "Excuse me?" He said, "I'm not the only person talking. We're talking. I'm not talking to myself. I'm talking to these other people. So are we all gonna give it to you, or is it just me?" And she goes, "Abdullahi, you are the most defiant child I have ever seen." And he goes, "Hey, my mom teaches defiance."
That's beautiful. Look,
I have never been more proud. I'm like, oh my God. Yes. So like that's the thing is we are taught to follow, follow the
Yes.
rules and follow the adults that are telling us what to do, the authorities that are telling us what to do blindly because that's what the rules are, right?
Yeah.
Who wrote those rules? Why are they there? Right? We have to have the skill set to interrogate every system that we're being forced to follow.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. I'm very glad your kids are learning from you. And I think because of this episode, a lot of people will learn from you today. We are not done. We'll do episode 2 and episode 3, and I hope you come to Minnesota. And if you convince enough Somalis to move to Phoenix, Arizona, I don't know, is it Phoenix where you are?
It's Phoenix, Arizona. Yeah, it's beautiful.
Awesome. Yes, yes.
It's hot in the summer, but there's like swimming pools and you can stay indoors, in air conditioning, but it's beautiful.
Every time I am about to complain about the heat, I remember the winter, and I was like, no, I would rather have it this hot every day than the snow. So I love the heat. Okay, I have a couple of rapid fire questions, and then we will conclude. But before I do that, any last word, anything that you wanted to end with, whether you want to talk about your book or the Defiance Academy or anything else you would like to highlight?
Yeah, so the book is coming out soon. Inshallah, we're wrapping up, and I would like to come to Minnesota for a book signing event. Inshallah, so for the Defiance Academy, I am teaching the entire curriculum. Okay, so the Defiant Career Strategy is 3 stages: stage 1, 2, and 3. 1 is taking up space, 2 is dominating your space, and 3 is owning your space and being a leader. And so I'm doing that teaching starting on June 1st. Like I teach the 3 different courses differently, independently. But for the first time, I'm teaching all of them on June 1st. So if anybody wants to join, June 1st is going to be our first cohort.
That's awesome. Is this only women or is it open to everybody?
So I have had men go through my programs.
Okay.
But the group coaching, we have a Defiant Women community. I reserve that for women only because it's a safe space. We need to have women only conversations. And so I reserve that for women only. But I have coached men independently.
Got it. Beautiful. Awesome.
And the curriculum, our stage 1 is self-paced and it's online. And so if anybody wants to learn that, it's open to everybody.
Perfect. All right. What is the website? Where do they go, people?
So they can go to defianceacademy.com.
Defianceacademy.com it is. Okay. Here are my 5 rapid questions, and then we will conclude. What is the best advice you have ever received? I have a feeling that it's going to be that question from your grandma, but if that is the one, then I need a second one.
The second one. So definitely the first one is my Ayayo. Who are you waiting for? And the second one is John Baduniak. When he told me, residency is a finite amount of time. We make a lot of decisions based on limited time things that we go through. Right? Oh, I don't want to. I don't want to go to medical school because I want to have kids. I don't want to, go to law school because I want to do this, this, and this. All those things are very short time, right? They will come and go. They will end, right? And so we're making a life, long decisions based on things that are happening for a very short time. So that actually changed how I think about a lot of things.
Wow. Go through something that might be uncomfortable or not that great, not because. But because of all the things that is going to happen afterwards. Yep. That is a really good framing to look at it. What is one book you recommend people to read and why?
Well, number 1 is the Quran. I think there are a lot of, life lessons. I mean, we're Muslims. The Quran has everything in it. And so when I am struggling with decisions, I can always fall back on the Quran. Tawakkaltu ala Allahi wa kafa billahi wakilan. I have no power, right? I can do the best that I can, but ultimately, I leave it to Allah. The second book that I would recommend is Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Okay, that book is very good in interpersonal communication, right? Especially if we're navigating hostile and challenging workplaces, where we're going to be disrespected and things like that. How to navigate those conversations strategically is very, very important. So that's a very good book that I would recommend.
I second that. I read that, and it's a really good book. I recommend as well. All right, coffee, tea, or neither?
Coffee.
Yes, coffee. There you go.
And you know, my boys, like almost all of my kids now,
Yes.
they're like my little baristas.
They
They have a little
there you go.
espresso machine and they can make it. Absolutely. Yeah.
That's awesome. I love coffee as well. Yeah, that's great. Favorite vacation spot?
You know, my favorite vacation spot would be Tahiti, but I have yet to go there. That's like on my bucket list.
There you go.
But a couple of years ago, my husband and I went to Nairobi and Rwanda.
Oh,
That was very nice.
that's awesome. Yes, I've been to Nairobi, but not to Rwanda. Yeah,
Rwanda is very beautiful.
yeah, awesome.
Very nice.
Awesome. My last question: what is a fun activity that you enjoy outside of work?
Fun
If there is
activity.
time outside of work. Yeah, I say if there is such a time. Yeah.
There is actually. I don't consider like I go for walks and exercise and but that's not fun. One of my favorite activities is actually I like making hot sauces. Like I
Really?
yeah, like homemade hot sauces. Homemade hot sauces.
Wow.
Like I make one with like avocado and tamarind and like it's delicious. I take it to work with me sometimes and my colleagues love it and they finish it. But I like experimenting with different versions. There was a time when like we bottled a hot sauce. Like,
Yeah.
yeah. I made it with like a bunch of vegetables. It was really nice. So hot sauce, like trying different brands and flavors of hot sauce and experimenting with them and cooking them is one of my favorite times. One of my sisters lives in here in Phoenix with me. She makes really good hot sauce that I like. I don't know how to make it. I make my
Yeah.
hot sauce, so we exchange.
There you go.
I make my hot sauce, send it to her. She brings me hers. Yeah.
Are any of those commercially available?
Not
Okay.
yet.
Yeah, not yet.
Not
Okay.
yet. That'll be our future endeavor, inshallah.
One day, one day. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Qaali. This has been one of the most eye-opening and fascinating conversation I've had. And we really, really thank you for joining us. Like I said, we're not done. There's so much questions that I have, but unfortunately we don't have enough time for it. We'll definitely do episode 2 and episode 3.
So now you see why I had to write the book.
100%. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, we've been working on it for some time, and like every edition, it's like, okay, now we have to add this. Oh no, I forgot. I have to add this story. So inshallah, the book will cover almost everything.
Right. Yes. That's awesome. That's awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Thanks.
All right, bye.